thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Brina Chu, and I serve as the Community Strategy Manager of Israel Action Network. For those of you who aren't familiar with us yet, hi, nice to meet you. We're a joint initiative of JFNA and JCPA committed to combating the delegitimization of Israel and providing the educational programs, trainings, and other resources for Jewish communities which they need to build support for Israel in the context of two states for two peoples. We recently unveiled a programming initiative we're calling IAN University, which is a portal for educational programming around Jewish security, fighting all forms of anti-Semitism, including BDS and delegitimization, and navigating difficult conversations around Israel with a wide range of constituencies. Our session today is Jewish Denominations Approach Israel and Zionism in response to the rising tide of anti-Zionism that IAN has been observing across delegitimization messaging in the US. This program serves as the second part of our three-part series exploring Zionism. We at IAN are bringing this to you in partnership with the American Zionist movement and leading up to the 38th World Zionist Congress, which will be held online this year in just under a week from October 20th to the 22nd. American Zionist Movement, or AZM, is comprised of 33 national Jewish Zionist organizations. They are the US Zionist Federation and the World Zionist Organization, or WZO, and recently facilitated the US election to the World Zionist Congress, where 123,000 American Jews voted for their voice in Israel. You can go to azm.org/38WZC to learn more about AZM and their upcoming 38th World Zionist Congress. And of course, you can join our upcoming session inside the World Zionist Congress happening this week, which will be this Monday, October 19th at 3 p.m. Eastern. You can learn more details about that and you can register by going to the link that will be posted in the chat shortly. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Rabbi Amy Katz, our moderator for today's conversation. So just to introduce you to her, Rabbi Amy Katz became the rabbi of Temple Beth El in August 2008. In addition to her congregational work, Rabbi Katz is featured in Moment Magazine's column, Ask the Rabbi. She was on the editorial committee for the conservative movement's new prayer book, Siddur Lev Shalem, and she is a faculty member of the Milton School. She recently completed the Shalom Hartman Rabbinic Leadership Institute and finds other excuses to travel to Israel as often as possible. So a few quick things before we start. First, the session will be recorded and we will be distributing the recording to those who registered but were unable to be here today. If you have any questions throughout this program, please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A function at any point so they can be addressed during our participant Q&A. Which will be around 1:30 p.m. Eastern. And with that, I thank you, and I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Amy to introduce our speakers and to start off our conversation for today. Thank you.
Thank you, and I want to thank you for convening our group to talk about this really important subject about Israel and our relationship to Zionism, which has become a complicated one. Before I even introduce our speakers, I actually want to say I was reading in Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan's diaries, and in 1914 he was going to Yale University to visit students, and he wrote that when he was going to visit to Yale, Zionism was something that attracted students and intrigued them and brought the students together, and it was a way to rally the crowd. And I was thinking how in 100 years how things have changed, because probably in 1914 we wouldn't have had a webinar to discuss this in quite the same way. The world has changed. And so I'm eager to hear from our panelists about their experiences. But first, let me introduce them. Rabbi Debra Newman Kamin came to Am Yisrael in 1990. In 1994, she became the congregation's sole rabbi. Rabbi Newman Kamin provides keen intellectual and spiritual guidance to the congregation. She's the immediate past president of the Rabbinical Assembly, the international membership organization of conservative rabbis. Rabbi Newman Kamin also serves on the Chancellor's Cabinet of the Jewish Theological Seminary, the seminary that trains and ordains conservative rabbis. She's a Hartman Fellow, and Rabbi Newman Kamin is the 2005 recipient of the Jewish Theological Seminary's Rabbi Simon Greenberg Rabbinic Achievement Award. Rabbi Newman Kamin is married, and she's the mother of 3 adult children. Representing the Orthodox world, we have Rabbi Elie Mischel, who grew up in Muncie, New York, and Boston, Massachusetts. He received his rabbinic ordination from Yeshiva University's Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary. Rabbi Mischel also holds a JD from the Cardozo School of Law and an MA in Modern Jewish History from the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies. He's an avid reader and adequate basketball player and a world-class knock hockey enthusiast. I don't even know what knock hockey is, but that's for another story. I learned just a few minutes ago that very soon he'll be making Aliyah with his family, with his 3 daughters and his 1 outnumbered son and his wife. So they're off to a flight, and we'll look forward to hearing about that and what that has to say about where you are and what you're thinking about Zionism in Israel. Rabbi Josh Weinberg serves as the Vice President of the URJ for Israel and Reform Zionism and is the Executive Director of ARZA, the Association of Reform Zionists of America. He was ordained from HUCJIR Israeli Rabbinic Program in Jerusalem, and he's currently living in New York. Josh has a passion for the environment and spends lots of time outdoors hiking, climbing, playing music, and volleyball. He's passionate about anything connected to Israel and hopes to strengthen the connection between the Reform movement and the Jewish state. He's married and is a proud Abba of 4 children. Okay. So with that, I think we'll start, and I'll ask a question, and maybe, I don't want to, you'll decide who wants to answer first. I think that makes the most sense. Maybe you'll just tell us a bit about your Jewish journey thus far. This could actually take the whole panel. Tell us a little bit about your Jewish journey thus far, how and why you chose to become a leader in your movement, and share some highlights and challenges of your experience as a denominational leader. So if one of you want to jump in? Okay, so I'll put you on the spot. Josh, would you mind starting?
Sure. Well, thank you, Amy. And I want to thank both the Israel Action Network and the American Zionist Movement for inviting us to be on this important session. And it's really an honor to be with my esteemed colleagues here. And I look forward to the discussion. So as you said, this could be an entire semester's course, essentially, on some of these challenges that we're looking at. But I'll try to say in brief, and I want to weave both the sort of the personal and the professional or the movement-wide approach that we're thinking about. So for me, I grew up very much in the Reform movement, youth group, synagogue, camp, Israel experience, and I was a bit of a seeker and tried lots of different things and different levels of observances, and also outside my own movement. And I realized that Israel and Zionism was actually the answer to my Jewish identity. And I wanted to come to Israel and be sort of a secular Zionist, a secular nationalist Jew, and just live in Israel and be like the Chalutzim and drain the swamps, or just, and work the land and be there. And I realized that my friend sort of laughed at me and said that I was about 100 years too late for that. And that I realized that I'm really no good at high tech and being part of the whole startup nation issue. And I was a Jewish educator, and I slowly came to realize a couple of things. One is that I couldn't really disconnect Judaism from Jewishness. Where many secular Israelis were sort of the mantra of the descendants of, Achad Ha'am and Berdichevsky, who came and said, okay, no, we have to recreate this new Jew concept, sans religion, essentially. And I said, no, that's actually not what we're looking at right now. And I realized that my Zionism was going to be to help bring liberal Judaism to Israel. I had a number of experiences that led me to that conclusion, what eventually led me to rabbinical school in Israel, because I wanted, I think that Israelis are hungry for an attachment not only to feeling this national sense of Judaism, but also very much asking deep questions about it, what it means to be Jewish in the Jewish state. And I realized that Israelis have woken up to a reality where having a Jewish state doesn't necessarily mean having a Jewish community. And that this sort of polarizing dichotomy between religious and secular no longer answers the needs of the mainstream. And so I saw my work very much to change and evolve that conversation and that societal need for a different kind of Judaism, for alternatives. And as much as I realized that Israel needs liberal Judaism or Reform Judaism also, I think that Reform Judaism outside of Israel very, very much needs Israel as well. Is that our community here in North America is also grappling with the questions of what it means to be Jewish and how do we connect to those things. And I want the whole Zionist enterprise, and I'll say this, looking historically, is that, no one fall out of their chairs when I tell you that the Reform movement wasn't, how should I say, overwhelmingly embracing of the Zionist enterprise at its inception. However, there was always a healthy tension. There were always those who said, yes, actually, this is something, this is something that's important to us and important to our movement. And of course, as Israel grew and is now, the largest Jewish community in the world, I'll leave it with this, that I think we have a great, the North American Jews, where the liberal movements are the largest movements in North America and where they're not the largest movements in Israel, we have a lot to learn from each other's experiences. And I know that we'll get to that later on in the discussion. So I see myself very much in the middle of that, trying to build a liberal Judaism or alternative form of Judaism in Israel, and trying to bring Israel also to our movements here in North America.
Great. Thank you so much. Elie, will you go next?
Thank you. It's such a joy to be a part of this panel. I grew up in what is often called a Baal Tshuva family. My parents only began the road to Orthodox Judaism when they were in college, with none of my extended family being Orthodox. My siblings and I, we grew up as part of the Orthodox community, but also attuned to the broader Jewish community in America as well. Zionism was part of the bread and butter of my childhood. My father set a very powerful example when he took a long leave from his Wall Street job to volunteer on a kibbutz during the first Intifada in 87, 88, when all the men were being called up to the army. Actions speak louder than words. That's something that is, I think that act is still reverberating through our family. I never intended to be a pulpit rabbi. I was a corporate lawyer before I ventured into the Wild West of the rabbinate. But truthfully, I found myself very frustrated and unfulfilled, not only at the office, that's for sure, but also in the synagogue. I often felt that the rabbis speaking from the pulpit were wonderful people and great Torah scholars, far greater than me, but that their speeches weren't really speaking to my soul, to my neshama. And so with the arrogance of youth, I figured I would try it myself. And what I quickly learned is what rabbis of every denomination know very, very well. It's that we are a very unique and complicated people. I learned that a person who can drive you crazy one day with absolute immaturity and childishness can do something absolutely selfless and holy the next day, right? It's a lesson that I think really speaks to our people as a whole, that we can be very, very difficult to deal with, but we're also capable of absolute greatness. I would say that just to finish, that a great highlight for me being in the rabbinate has been working together with a group of amazing, amazing Jews of all denominations on creating our local Livingston annual Yom Ha'atzmaut festival, which attracts 1,000 people a year. These are not rabbis and cantors. I was the only rabbi really involved in a heavy way, but just good-hearted Jews who put all of their differences aside to celebrate the miracle of modern Israel. And it was really inspiring to be a part of it. And it's moments like that that give me the joy here in the rabbinate. So thank you.
Debra?
I want to echo what everybody else said. Just thank you for having invited us and to be part of this. So when I think back, I grew up in a home that I would say was emotionally Zionist, but nobody had ever actually traveled to Israel. But I actually have a certificate after, during the 6-Day War. I was 7 years old and I set up a little table in front of my yard and I sold like some of my toys, and I raised 70 cents and I sent it to Hadassah for Israel. And I actually have the certificate. So that was sort of my first, I guess, foray into Zionism and fundraising. Two skills that as a pulpit rabbi since 1990, called upon to use both of those skills in my life. So I, was raised to feel very strongly about Zionism, but again, without a sense of, what did it mean? Nobody in my household I grew up in discussed, Herzl's vision versus Achad Ha'am's vision. It was just, you love Israel. And so when I was a junior in college, I went to spend a year in Israel. I was the first person in my family to travel to Israel. And it was an incredibly important spiritual year for me. It was an educational year for me. I happened to also meet the man who would become my husband, who was an American Jew, my husband Daniel. So it was an incredibly fruitful year for me, and it really began, I would say, the foundation of my education as a Zionist. And I want to say lifelong Zionist and a passionate supporter of Israel, but not, a blind supporter of Israel, a person that's always been well aware of the fact that Israel is a complicated society. I have to say, as a young woman who was raised in the Midwest, the Israeli persona was a little jarring. It took me a little bit of time to get used to Israeli culture, and also to really be able to, in an educated way, discuss how complicated Israel can be, spiritually, politically, and how you learn, as I think those of us that love Israel and engage in it in a passionate way, how you learn, and maybe this is true about Judaism in general, how you learn to be both passionately in love with something, and at the same time be able to be a critical thinker. And I think for a large part, that's why I found myself enamored of the conservative movement, and why I have been a conservative rabbi, a member of our Rabbinical Assembly since 1990 when I was ordained, and eventually became very, very involved in our board and in a leadership role, culminating becoming the president of the Rabbinical Assembly, with my term finished in March. And one of the things that I love about the conservative movement is that we are called upon at all times to have a foot in two camps, the foot of critical thinking and the foot of passionate love for Torah. And we hold both of those things at the same time. One of the things that I've really come to appreciate, and this is true about Israel and many other things in our movement, is one of the things in the United States that is missing, I think, in our political rhetoric, is a passionate center. We are such a partisan society that is very hard to be in the center today, and to be able to look at things in a very nuanced way, and to see that while you may have passionate political views, it's very possible that people on the other side aren't all wrong. And that is sometimes difficult in Israeli politics. It has become far more difficult in our politics in the United States. So one of the reasons that I suppose I was initially attracted to the conservative movement, and why I've continued to be a passionate supporter of the movement, is to be part of a movement. This is what I always say. So I grew up at the tail end of the 1960s, and I kind of missed the counterculture. The young people that were just 5 or more years older than me were the Woodstock generation. We thought they were such a cool generation, and my generation was sort of kind of wannabes to the counterculture because we had been too young. So what I like to say now, being in a movement that's passionate about being in the center, means that I actually, for the first time in my life, am actually countercultural, because being in the center is countercultural in our reality today. So one of the things that I've loved about the conservative movement is that I feel very comfortable amongst my colleagues who both are passionately committed to Israel, but also critical thinkers when it comes to Israel. And so I find myself with a great deal in common with the vast majority of rabbis in my movement. one of the interesting challenges, and we may get into this a little bit later, is that that does not seem to be so true of the youngest generation of rabbis. And certainly I see this at the congregation amongst our college students. Amy, like you, I went back and looked at some of the early writings of the founders of our movement, of the conservative movement, who looked to Israel as an incredibly unifying force. And that's not so easy today, and not so true. And so as all rabbis, I think, are called upon now to navigate some, much more difficult waters, and to try to encourage our young people to be both passionate supporters of Israel, but at the same time understanding and being able to push back at the complexities.
So that really gets to a real issue that I think would help people understand a little bit more about Zionism, and that is, maybe you could describe some points in your movement about Zionism. In other words, how would you say your movement relates to Zionism? What does your movement do well vis-a-vis Israel? What, on the flip side, what are some of the tensions, and what are some of the things where you think, well, gee, my movement could actually address this particular issue better? So what, and especially think of like the outsider who doesn't really know Orthodoxy or Reform or Conservative Judaism, how could they answer that? Elie, do you mind if I start with you?
Sure. So I am a religious Zionist, right, which means that I'm part of a community that is fully traditional and Orthodox, but which also perceives the establishment and the incredible growth of the modern state of Israel from a deeply religious perspective, meaning I believe that we are living in truly miraculous times, and that we're living through a time of redemption. It's gradual redemption, as the rabbis talked about in the Talmud, that the final redemption would come gradually, sort of as the sun gradually rises and light increases. But I believe we are living during that time. We're seeing before our very eyes the fulfillment of biblical prophecies, like the ingathering of the exiles, the flowering of the land, the rebuilding of Jerusalem. We're witnessing miracles that our grandparents and their grandparents and generations of Jews yearned for and prayed for with all of their hearts. I mean, I believe that it's hard not to see God's hand at work here, and that it's hard not to sense that God is smiling down upon us, upon our generation, and calling upon Jews everywhere to return home to Israel. So I think that captures, in a big picture sense, what it means to be a religious Zionist. And I think it also captures the difficulty that religious Zionism is having, not so much in Israel today, where religious Zionism is enormous and thriving, but here in America. Because what does it mean to be a religious Zionist in America, right? Or God is knocking at our door. To use the famous, the great Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, he talked about how the knocks, that God is literally knocking on our door, using the imagery from the Song of Songs, calling upon us to come back to the land. And right, the Messiah is in the process of happening, right? The redemption is happening, and we're here. And what are we doing, right? Why are we still in America? And that becomes a great challenge for the religious Zionist movement here in America, particularly as Israel is growing stronger and stronger, and the need for American Jews to support Israel has gotten smaller. Meaning, well, obviously we need to continue to support Israel, and certainly all the political work that we do on Israel's behalf is important. But Israel is not nearly as tenuous as it used to be. Israel is so incredible. I mean, it's incredible what's happening there. I mean, now it's the largest, by far, the largest Jewish community in the world. And it's a regional power. So with that set of what does it mean to be a religious Zionist in America? What are we doing here? Why are we not going to Israel and joining our brothers and sisters there? So that's one of the great questions that our particular brand of Zionism is struggling with right now. And we have some very special people, good people who are working on precisely that question.
And you're going.
We are going, right? We are going. And the truth is, we're not alone. I mean, I think that the numbers of people who are moving to Israel have shot up. certainly within the, I guess you would call it the modern Orthodox religious Zionist community in America, we have, there are hundreds of young people each year who are choosing not to come back after their gap year in Israel because they feel that they want to be part of the center of Jewish destiny and not on the fringes. So that is it's an amazing thing. It's a fantastic phenomenon, and there's so many people of all ages who are going. Right, the question then remains, right? What does it mean to be a religious Zionist in America? That's really the big question today.
Great. Debra, can I ask you?
So I live in a very different reality, right? The people that I am serving in my congregation are not asking these questions at all. They're asking very different questions. So I will tell you just a story from my own personal life. My husband and I used to call Zionism, until the last election, my husband and I called Zionism topic number one. My husband is a professor at DePaul University in Chicago and teaches Israel and the Palestinian conflict. So this is like all we ever talked about at the dinner table. And our kids actually were surprised sometimes when they would visit other people's homes that this was not the number one topic. And we raised 3 Zionists, but the conversations were very, very, let's just say, lively. So our older son, before COVID, is involved in a conservative synagogue. He attends with mostly people his age, 20-somethings, every Shabbat morning, and told me that it is extremely common on Shabbat morning when the congregation reads a prayer for Israel and they stand, that many of the participants in the minyan sit. They won't stand for the prayer for Israel. So this is a phenomena that's really new. Young Jews that go to synagogue every Shabbat, but show their unhappiness or discomfort with Israel by sitting during the prayer for Israel. And this is a phenomenon that we have, that we don't even know how to begin to address. These aren't people that, if they only knew. These are a lot of day school kids that were raised in our camps, in our movement. And we don't know where this is going to take us, right? We really don't know. These are not fringe kids. As a matter of fact, we tend to find, at least I see in the synagogue, that the kids that go on birthright, who have a far more superficial Israel experience than a young person who's gone through a lifelong, day school camp immersion, tend to be much more gung-ho about Israel. And so this is a real, this is new, and I'm not really quite sure how our movement is even going to, we're only just beginning to address this and to figure out how we have a seat at the table for younger people who consider themselves passionately spiritual, ritually observant. Or as one young person said to me, Israel is not part of my Jewish spirituality. That feels so foreign to me because Israel is so much a part of my Jewish spirituality. If you get me on the right day, I can be moved to tears by reading, an early Zionist, poem. I will say the other thing, if I'm going to be, you asked us to be a little bit critical of our own movements. One of the things that I will be critical about the conservative movement is that we have a thriving movement in Israel. In Israel, the conservative movement is called the Masorti movement. And we struggle in the United States, one of the wealthiest Jewish communities in all of Jewish history. We struggle raising money and support for our movement in Israel, which is an incredible, incredible shame. This is something that I would hope that people would be passionate about, that we would want to see a strong, vibrant movement in Israel that we feel answers the needs of a segment of the Israeli population that could really thrive, and it's like pulling teeth to get people to support our movement, and that I find a great frustration. Our rabbis that practice in Israel, barely make, it's hard to make a living. It's hard to find, support for their congregations, and we should have a partnership that is, fully supportive. And unfortunately, at this point, I have to say we don't.
Josh?
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to say, coming after hearing both Rabbi Mischel and Rabbi Newman Kamin, so much of what you said resonated for me. And that I want to say that I also see myself as a religious Zionist. And I see that our movement, who very much identifies as a theological-based movement, sees our commitment to Israel as part of three sacred relationships that we as Jews should have. I didn't make this up, by the way. This comes from our tradition, that where we say Yisrael oraita v'kudsha v'richu, that God, Torah, and Israel. And I'm blessed with a movement that I think is the most diverse movement in Jewish life when it comes to age, gender, sexual orientation, skin color, and of course, political ideology as well. And that what we see, we have liberal, small c, conservative, and people really across the board. And so those relationships with Israel, God, and Torah there could be a huge variety of how those manifest within those who are affiliated or members of the Reform movement. Now, let me say just a word about the official Reform movement, and here's where some of the challenges will come in as well. We are, I think, as outward and moving in the direction of a completely Zionist movement as possible. Okay, if we look at the platforms and the statements that we've made, and we were the first religious movement to affirm the Jerusalem program of the World Zionist Organization that we did in 2018. And if you happened to be at our biennial convention, which took place in the unimaginable pre-COVID times where we could convene, we had Israel all over the place, and it was such a force of nature. And I think that we're moving in that direction. We have so many people who are hungry and thirsty, and I could be invited to a different congregation every Shabbat to come and talk and to come and help them think about what their relationship to Israel looks like and what programming might look like. And with that, I think that we also have a growing understanding or a growing challenge where, and I'll pick up on what Rabbi Newman came and said also, where people don't see Israel as part of their Jewish identity. Our movement really, carries the flag of social justice and tikkun olam in a very strong way, and especially when things are a bit heated. I hear there's something going on in America in the beginning of November. I don't know, where there's an election, or our movement is very, very much organized when we run a civic engagement campaign to get out the vote and all of the important issues. And my message to my movement is that Zionism is also a social justice movement. Okay, and that if we look back at the Zionist forefathers and mothers who were writing and trying to create this sort of what we call a chevra lemofet, this exemplary society or utopian, egalitarian society in Israel, that's what we're trying to commit. And our Zionism is about how do we bring Israel to fulfill its aspirational model as articulated in the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel, for instance. That's at the core. Okay, and what we're hearing now is a growing, and this is not new, this is for the past, I think, 40 years almost to say, is that we're hearing a growing sense of frustration with the State of Israel as how it treats Reform and conservative and non-Orthodox Jews. And to say, oh, I can be a passionate Zionist, but how do I reckon with the fact that Israel doesn't recognize me as Jewish, or won't count my marriage, or won't recognize my rabbi as my rabbi, or my conversion may not be valid? And that is a very, very serious issue. Okay. And part of my answer, and this is where the criticism, pointed this way, towards my own movement goes, is that I think we need to do a better job of showing up. Okay, in that the statistics, this is already now dated. The famous Pew study of 2013 showed us that only 43% of those who identify as Reform Jews have been to Israel, and that number has doubled in the past 20 years, by the way. So we're moving, but we should be sending thousands of kids to Israel in the summer for our semester programs, for our gap year programs, and not hundreds. And every Reformed Jew should have at least one, experience in Israel, if not to encourage Aliyah. I was the anomaly, the standout who made Aliyah, and I grew up, of course, as Rabbi Newman. I grew up in a Zionist household, and my parents went and volunteered in the kibbutzim, and during the 70s, and that was part of my DNA. But it was fascinating when I told members of my own movement that I was going to move to Israel, And most of them were over the moon and excited for me. And some people said, well, why would you do that? Because we feel very, very comfortable here in America, and America is our home. There's no, the notion of diaspora or the center, I think, has changed very, doesn't really speak to most Reform Jews. We prefer, I'll suggest a different model of the philosopher Shimon Ravidovich, who sort of rejects the model of a bicycle wheel with a center and opts for an ellipse with two foci, right, on either side, to say, no, we are on equal footing to Israel, to that center. And it's a very difficult conversation, especially with Israelis, with our movement. And we just put out a book called Deepening the Dialogues through our Rabbinical organization, the CCAR, which is a sort of a chevruta between North American, mostly rabbis and scholars, versus Israeli, and how do we bridge that gap? So that's a big challenge to us. And I think that at the end of the day, those who are critical of Israel are critical out of love, to say these are the Jewish values that we learned in the Reform movement of, equality, freedom, tolerance, democracy. That we look at our Jewish texts, and we're coming up, of course, on Breshit, and we say that that if each individual is in fact created in the image of God, how does that play out in real life? Or when our text tells us that we should take care of the ger almana v'yatom, right? The powerless, the orphan, the widow, and the stranger among us. How does that manifest? And what grade should we receive as we're doing that in the Jewish state? So I think that we see our work. My hope is that we see our work both applying to the local community where we happen to live, and for that, and to hold the Jewish state to those high standards of the values that we represent. And that's a continuous, ongoing debate, it's never a dull movement. That's what's going to happen next week at the World Zionist Congress as well.
So I want to move to some of the participant questions. I do want to say I'm also hoping you could speak a little bit about the experience of being a delegate at the World Zionist Congress, and how you balance your own personal ideology with the ideologies of your movement, because you've actually each spoken about the fact that there are a range of there's conflict and there's tension. So that's one piece, that's a question. But I also, and I think this is really more for Debra and Josh than it is for Elie, but I have to ask, what are we going to do with these young adults? How do we respond to young adults who don't want to stand for the prayer for Israel, or who are turned off? How do we help bring them back? How can your movement address what Rabbi Newman came and raised about this next generation of rabbis, this next generation really being indifferent, ambivalent? Ideally, I'll take that. I worry about maybe anti or uninterested, or we have more negative feelings. So I'm asking two questions right now. One is about your own experience in the World Zionist Congress, and if you can try and answer a little more concisely, because I know that we have more questions on the Q&A board too. So Debra, will you start us this time?
Sure. So I was thrilled to be on the slate for the World Zionist Congress, and it's my first time, so I probably could answer this question better. I'm thrilled, and I feel that I am able to represent our movement, because even though we're going to talk about the younger generation, I feel like I am pretty much right in line with the vast majority of at least from the Rabbinical Assembly colleagues that I'm representing. I'll tell you one thing I feel really strongly about. I watched this happen with J Street, right? They were just excoriated when they started. And now, by mainstream, many mainstream in the Jewish community, now they look quite moderate compared to, if not now, and other movements on the left. And I felt this way for a very long time, which is you have to just let everybody have a seat at the table. The worst thing we could do to our young people is to tell them that they have nothing to say, they have nothing to add, be quiet. When you grow up, you'll understand. Who would want to stay at that table? So I feel like, you know, we have to let them have their voice. You already told you I'm enamored of the counterculture. So we have to let them have their voice. We have to not, you know, publicly shame them. Maybe they will change their minds after they have more experience, but we cannot, you know, just write them off. And I think we work with them where what we have in common. And you know, there's, you know, listen, how we learn to disagree with anybody is one of the biggest challenges of the time that we're living in. And it's not just with our young people, it's with anybody that disagrees with us. And it's a huge struggle, but I feel like we just cannot afford to write off our young people by not giving them a voice and by publicly, you know, attempting to shame them into right behavior.
Elie?
I think that, you know, thinking about this very profound problem, so many young Jews leaving the Zionist path or expressing their Zionism in a very counterintuitive way, I guess, to be kind. I think it really comes down to a very deep question of self, which is, you know, how do we identify and what are we teaching our children, right? Are we Jewish Americans? We're Americans who also happen to be Jewish, in which case, you know, I'm also maybe progressive and I have a lot of other things that I believe in. And so Judaism can become a very small part of that. Or are we American Jews, right? Are we Jews first and foremost to our very core who live in America? We're proud of America, as some of my fellow panelists have said, and I agree with them fully. This is the greatest exile that we have ever experienced. America is a nation of kindness, of chesed, and we can never stop saying thank you. But at the same time, I will say unequivocally, and I think that it's essential for everyone to say unequivocally, that I am a Jew first, and that is who I am. That's what we believe. I'm not a progressive, I'm not a conservative, right? It's not about politics first and foremost. You can have political views, but those are all tangential to who we are as Jews. We are Jews, right? And that's what it means to be an American Jew, in my opinion, that Israel is the center, that America is not co-equal, right? All of Jewish tradition for thousands of years, right? We have yearned for Israel. And so to say that, you know, I mean, this is where I would disagree, I guess, with many others. You know, I think if we're saying that America is just as important as Israel, right, the American Jewish community, that we are the center just as Israel is, I think we're missing the point of all of Jewish tradition, which is focusing and yearning to come back to the land of Israel, that yearning for the Messiah. That identity as a Jew will create passion and connection that we can pass on to our children. But if we ourselves are tenuous, if we ourselves are political before we are religious, right? If our religion has turned into politics and so on, then our children will get that message, and they too will see Zionism as a distant second, third, fourth, or fifth in their ranking of values. So that's the call. That's why this is what I believe, and it goes across denominations. Our children are looking to us to show them what matters and what's real. And if we are passionate about Israel, if we are really, really passionate, if that is our identity, we're not ourselves confused, then there's a far better chance that our children will be passionate as well.
Josh?
Yeah, I'll build on that. I think we definitely have to be passionate. I think we have to be thoughtful as well. I just want to say that I'm incredibly proud of our young people in our movement who are activists and who are trying to speak truth to power, which is, you know, almost cliche to say now, but in that, you know, just in these recent elections for the World Zionist Congress, we had mobilized our entire youth movement, and we had a teen fellowship for those who wanted to volunteer and to get out the vote, and because they really understood that you can't complain or if you're not going to be involved and try to make change. Just like in the United States, where most of our young people, I don't think it'll come as a great shock to say that they're not, you know, huge fans of the current administration, and they're also doing the same in the state. And I said, okay, listen, if you don't like what's happening in Israel, you disagree with the policies, we want to say that we stand that we are Zionist true and true, and that Israel is part of who we are, and that we want to be involved. And that's the message that we're trying to say. Now, I think that I can be as passionate as I want, but I have to also meet them where they are. And that is critical. And I spent a lot of time this summer in the past 6 months doing a lot of listening to what some of our young people are saying. And I just want to emphasize that I can't generalize here, because we really do have a broad spectrum where some represent some organizations on both the left and the right. And so we're really experiencing that. But to say, okay, in the Israel education that you provide us, whether it's in our synagogues or in our summer camps, don't ignore and don't whitewash Israel's problems, and get into some of the real deep complexities. We can handle it, and we're actually going to be better for it. So for instance, if our students or graduates of our camps, youth movements, synagogues, whatever that looks like, arrive on college campuses and have never heard of the Palestinians, for instance, I think that we've done them a great disservice. And by the way, there is a huge variety of what that discussion looks like on college campuses today. Huge variety. It's not that all college campuses are, the front of war and Israel-Palestine issues. That's not quite the case. And I think that we want our people to come out as critical thinkers, and to have a strong base of a Jewish identity, because I don't want to separate Israel education from Jewish education. It has to be part and parcel of it. And I think that before a student reaches, hopefully bar mitzvah, but at least, 18 years old, that they've spent considerable time in Israel and has seen for themselves and a chance to learn. And only then they can come. And, when I talk to my foreign ministry friends, and, they tell me, they say, oh, your young people just don't know enough. And it's actually the people who have the deepest and, I would say, broadest knowledge base, who have read everything and they've gone back and forth and spent many times in Israel. They're the ones who are coming to us and are the most critical. And that's wonderful. And I want to recognize that these are our current leaders, not the future of the Jewish people, whatever. These are our leaders right now who are writing the op-eds, and they are protesting, and they are standing up for what's important to them. And I think it's our role to harness that and to have it be part of a larger movement that can help to work for change, and to say that this is who we are as Jews, and we can't. Even if we're upset with Israel, we can be upset with God, and we can be upset with Torah also, but we can't, how should we say, kick any of them off the island, so to speak. So that's a big challenge for us right now.
So I just want to summarize what I think of as what I heard from each of you to sort of say, this is the Torah that I'm taking away, and this is what I'm going to kind of wrestle with. And if I've misquoted you, correct me, because I want to wrestle with what you said, not with what I think you said. And I'm hoping that the people who are listening, the participants, will either have found something of themselves for themselves to wrestle with, or perhaps I can give you a takeaway. Josh, early in your talk, you talked about how you want to bring reform or liberal Judaism to Israel, and you said we need Israel in the American reform world. And I want to say, when you said that, I thought, because Israel is so challenging and complicated, and yet you're saying we need Israel. Shabbat's so easy, holidays are so easy. They unify us, and Shabbat and Israel can be divisive and difficult and challenging and complicated. And yet, I heard you say we need Israel, and so I want to chew on that and think about how and why and what you meant. Debra, I actually have not heard of people sitting during the prayer for the state of Israel. I'll admit, in my congregation, we sit for both the prayer for Israel and the prayer for America. But what I really heard is a protest, and I'd not heard of a protest in shul. I've heard of protest in other places, and I welcome that, but that's really leading me to think if in the synagogue we're wrestling with praying that the leaders of the state act wisely, then that shows a deep issue that I have to wrestle with. And Elie, your world is the least known to me, but to hear you talk about, well, what does it mean to be a religious Zionist, and how does one express and live an active religious Zionist life if you happen to be here? Like, how do you do that? That strikes me as also a very profound issue that needs to really be addressed. And so I thank you, because you've left me with three things to think about that feel really important and significant. And all this takes me back to the World Zionist, to the World Zionist Congress. And I want to say that I know there's a lot going on with the Congress the next few weeks, and I want to invite people who are interested to participate in upcoming webinars and programs, because there's much more that you can learn, and there was information that was put in the chat box, and you should really avail yourself. I feel like the World Zionist Congress is one of these things that we've all heard of it, but none of us really know what it is and what it's like. And so taking time to educate ourselves and to imagine what's it like to be a delegate there, what's going to be addressed, how's it going to be addressed, and actually how will it affect the Jewish life here and in Israel, feel like really important questions to try and resolve and make sense of. So I want to thank the conveners of this panel. And again, I want to thank Rabbi Newman, Kamin, Rabbi Weinberg, Rabbi Mischel for taking the time to bring your true selves to the conversation. But not just for that, but for the time and attention that you give to the Jewish people to ensure a stronger American Jewish world, a stronger Israel, and a stronger bond between American Jews and Israel. So thank you very much.
Thank you.